So, with me today is Professor Joseph Alter. He wrote a book called Yoga in Modern India in 2005, one of the leading and the early exponents of how yoga has changed in modern times, or just kind of unveiling the curtain on what was old ideas of asana in the 17th century, yoga pradipika, 15th century maybe, Joseph, you'll probably correct me, Garendra Samhita, and Shiva Samhita, and these fundamental kind of ideas of yoga as a means for immortality, as a means for tapas, or purifying the body alchemically, something very different to what we're doing today. And it's people like Joseph who started, as he was telling me before, looking at Indian wrestling and how that was actually very similar to yoga, that have started to kind of show us that there's a slightly broader, or at least perhaps more ambiguous kind of train or trajectory of yoga as it came out of India in the 20th century in the way that we know it now, through figures like Vivekananda and Yogendra and Kavilyananda of Lonavala, Kavalidam. So welcome, Joseph. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you already and have you here today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's always a wonderful opportunity to be able to talk about things of my interest, to hopefully answer some questions that members of the audience have, and to engage in an ongoing conversation to better understand yoga.
So, I mean, you mentioned that you're kind of more comfortable now with the ideas of yoga as a system of kind of inner sacrifice or ritualistic preservation of semen for the sake of generating siddhis, magic powers. A tantra, kundalini's always been very much in there, and the old idea of immortality. And then suddenly we see all this stuff from asceticism, yoga as asceticism or penance, the bat penance example in the tantric text, and then we see yoga, come through with Buddhist tantric ideas and this idea of Vajrayogini mudra and control, sexual continency or control of semen, etc., etc. And then we have the yoga pradipika. So suddenly we have a whole text with 18 or so asanas, and all things all seem a bit clear. And then we have this huge break, and suddenly we have these different people on the scene, and yoga becomes used for medical reasons. There's in BKS Iyengar, there's a huge medical tradition now, and especially now today, actually, where yoga is now this idea of the sympathetic nervous system and co-regulating that. And also philosophically, things have changed, I would say, a bit from Vivekananda's ideas, which are essentially neo-Hindu ideas. So I'm just babbling, really. I'd like you to say something about this now, and I'll interject.
Sure.
If possible.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really a fascinating history. And, my area of expertise is the 20th century, although I'm always fascinated by the transformations in practice in earlier centuries. And certainly many of my colleagues, Jason Birch, James Mallinson, have done absolutely fabulous work on the early history of yoga and pushing it closer and closer to clarify what seems to have been a radical transformation in the early 20th century. But as these colleagues remind me, the better we understand what was happening in the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, the clearer it becomes that there are lines of continuity that help us to better understand the discontinuities and the transformations. So, it's a fascinating case of folks with different expertise seeing things slightly differently, but then producing knowledge that helps to clarify the logic of transformation. But you are right. I mean, certainly there is a literature on the practice of yoga which perceives the possibility of transforming the body in ways that are radical and extreme and, in some sense, supernatural, using that word very cautiously. That is, doing things which seem to be beyond believable. Immortality, the transformation of the body into a form where it no longer really changes. But if we think about sort of the underlying logic of practice, which seeks to transform the body and embodied experience, there's continuity across the practice of different kinds of yoga that may appear to be radically different from one another, but ultimately the point of transformation, however it is put into practice and whatever it leads to, is a framework that helps to provide continuity to radically different forms of practice. So the medicalization of pranayama to treat COPD, for example, is a transformation of the body in one form, whereas pranayama, in order to achieve immortality, is the transformation within a very different rubric. But they're the transformation of the body, nevertheless. So the question is how do these logics get put into practice in relation to particular kinds of goals? And, I got interested, as we were speaking about a moment ago, in yoga, precisely because one of the scholars who I was very influenced by when I was a young man, first entering into the world of physical culture, Dr. Shanti Prakash Atriya, who was the son of Bhikkhan Lal Atriya, a professor of philosophy at Banaras Hindu University, who was a scholar whose expertise was in the Yoga Vishisht. But Shanti Prakash Atriya synthesized intensely physical forms of practice in the gymnasiums of Indian wrestling, Pahalwani, with his understanding of yoga in the Samkhyan tradition of self-transformation based on the elements. And so he combined the practice of dand and baitak with asana and pranayama with vigorous forms of aerobic exercise in order to make the argument, which is really very convincing if you can see past the differences of the bodies, one which is enormous and bulky and strong, and the other which is lithe and, the image of BKS Iyengar comes to mind, who is not a Pahalwan, but Shanti Prakash Atriya's argument was that the transformation of the body can lead to different forms, but the essential elements that are at the core of the process of transformation are essentially the same. They can be operationalized in different ways. And so it was this question that really got me interested in yoga as a form of physical exercise, which is only one way of looking at it, but certainly in the context of the 20th century, as my colleague Mark Singleton has probably pointed out more clearly than anyone else, has really shaped the practice of postural yoga.
And you mentioned, you say there's two particular figures, right? Both from Mumbai. Two men living in Mumbai, presidency. They have the biggest effect, to yoga asana today, or in and of yoga asana today. Do you want to talk about Yogendra and Kevalananda?
They're, in my view, I think really two of the pivotal figures who have shaped the practice of postural yoga and medicalized yoga, I would say, in the 20th century. Swami Kuvalyanand is a very well-known figure in the history of contemporary yoga because he established the institute at Lonavale in Kaivalyanam, where he essentially was trying to use modern scientific methods to prove the value and the efficacy of postural practice and also psychological possibilities in the practice of yoga. So he was synthesizing the historical literature that he had access to with a methodology of contemporary scientific research. And then his goal was to popularize and to promote the practice of yoga as a form of self-development that could be the alternative to the colonial forms of self-development that were manifest in the YMCA and physical fitness that came through the British infrastructure of public school education. So in his mind, yoga was an indigenous form of self-development in the broadest sense, physical as well as mental, that could really enhance the citizenry of independent India. Now, Sri Yogendra was really operating at the same time in Bombay proper, and Sri Yogendra was doing very much the same kinds of things, but was doing it in a way where he was really trying to combine physical fitness with forms of postural practice that could promote wellness and promote health and well-being. So he was medicalizing it in very much the same way as Kuvalyanand, but doing it in a mode that was probably more popular in purpose, whereas Kuvalyananda was institutionalizing it within the Kaivalidhan framework. Now, interestingly, both Yogendra and Kuvalyanand were heavily influenced by the culture of gymnasiums in different ways. Kuvalyanand was part of Rajratan Manik Rao's gymnasium in Gujarat, and Yogendra, as a young man, participated in wrestling bouts and competitions before he then made the transition to a postural practice. So there's an interesting question here. If Shanti Prakash Atreya was doing this in the 1940s under the influence of his father, Bikhanlal Atreya, a professor of philosophy at BHU, if Yogendra was influenced by the culture of the gymnasium in Maharashtra, and if Kuvalyananda was influenced by Manik Rao's gymnasium in Gujarat, there is an important historical connection between these forms of practice, which on the surface seem to be completely disconnected from one another. And that's what I've spent a lot of my time trying to sort out, both in terms of the historical flow of ideas that influence people, as well as what I think is the underlying integrity of the logic that connects yoga as a form of physical practice to other forms of physical practice in terms of the internalization of energy and power and the symbolic significance of the different elements that go into self-development.
How do you see the bodybuilding aspect involved in yoga? We have other figures on the scene, right? We have I can't remember the guy now in Mysore Palace who was a bodybuilder, had the gym. Very nice guy, it seemed.
Right.
As opposed to Krishnamacharya, who people had different things to say about. This guy was apparently very nice. And Sundaram, right? Sundaram's was also a disciple of I think it wasn't Rao, was it? It's another figure. You'll tell me. And obviously, and Bose from Calcutta.
Calcutta,
and,
right?
Yeah, and what was he doing? I mean, how do these figures also influence? Because there's a whole bunch of people on the scene, and it's latterly. I mean, the next question will be like, can we escape from politics in terms of the way that yoga has developed in the current age, right? As right. Something for Indians to get behind and build a strong nation and build and kick out those Brits,
Right. Yeah, well, fundamentally, I mean, there's no escaping the politics of it, and I think that politics as a problem informs the decisions about what the goal of the transformation of the body is in many ways. And I think, the point about bodybuilding is really interesting because it's a process of embodied transformation, absolutely, which is to put the focus on the both the substance of the body, but also the appearance of the substance of the body. Bodybuilding is different from physical fitness in that it's meant to produce a body to be looked at and to be shown off. And as anybody who is aware of even the most elemental aspects of yoga can appreciate, that is problematic because it does what many would regard as precisely the antithesis of what many people regard as the fundamental point of yoga, which is to avoid the sense of ego, the sense of your own importance, shall we say, in a very generic way. And so there are profound contradictions and paradoxes manifest in yoga as bodybuilding. And that is simply an issue that highlights the underlying tensions between the various different goals of transformation. And also, but it does relate back to the politics of it as well, because what was going on in terms of yoga bodybuilding in Bose and Sundaram and others was the development of a counterpoint to the emergence of bodybuilding as exemplified by Eugene Sandow and Bernard McFadden in the 30s and 40s, who were developing their body on the basis of a kind of physical exercise that did things to change the appearance of the body. And what many of the practitioners of yoga were doing is to say, yoga produces a body which is substantively different. And the appearance of difference is important in terms of how. So if you look at the way in which the poses of Bose and Sundaram draw attention to musculature and physique that highlights different parts of the body, for example, the abdominal recti and the exaggeration of the definition of those muscles. There's an important way in which what that does is it signifies the power of the practice of certain kinds of breathing, as opposed to forms of muscular development through, weightlifting, for example. So the appearance is very similar. I mean, if you look at a bodybuilder like Bose, it's easy to say, oh, well, that's just a mimicry of the bodybuilding of Eugene Sandow, but I think it's really much more complex than that and much more interesting, quite frankly.
Well, also, I mean, do you remember the bodybuilding, the gymnasium in the Mysore Palace? Who that was?
I don't, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
I'm so frustrated. You know that there was a guy literally down the road, down the corridor, like in the next, just like a few rooms down, in the Mysore Palace, whilst Krishnamacharya was teaching his yoga, who was, a kind of exponent. He wasn't just bodybuilding. He started incorporating yoga and all kinds of things into his training, right? And some scholars have really kind of said that Krishnamacharya cribbed a lot of stuff off this guy, who my memory as I get older gets worse, unfortunately. But I mean, I think it was said of this guy that he started out trying to mimic the form, like a godly form, there's a kind of archetype of certain proportions in certain kind of Hindu gods, and he was trying to kind of transmute his form into that form. Kind of rather interesting point there.
I'll have to look into that. Honestly, I was not aware of that very important issue, because it sets up a very interesting point of communication and differentiation within the Mysore Palace, which I think is critically important to understanding both what this fellow was doing as well as, therefore, what Krishnamacharya was doing, which is not the same as that. So something for somebody to look into with really great results, I'm sure.
And also, I mean, the idea that Sundram was taken along and incorporated into, he was doing a yoga part in a bodybuilding display. So there was, a display of bodybuilding, and then there was, and Krishnamacharya obviously did it as well. Iyengar was, famed for taking yoga into the public domain and doing these displays early on. So it did become a performative kind of discipline fairly early on, didn't it?
Right.
But going back to the politicization of it, I mean, I was just kind of trying to kind of get you to elaborate on how, especially figures like Vivekananda were taking something and kind of, I suppose, as I understand it, doing two things. One, tried to promote a strong Indian population to counter the British, kind of at their own game, using, a lot of military and gymnastic techniques that they probably synthesised from, to some degrees, the British, along with wrestling indigenous techniques. And secondly, just try to clean up their own acts in a way, like say, well, we don't want to, we don't want to talk about Jim Mallison and I did a podcast almost exclusively on the Vajroli Mudra and the tube and inserted the tube and all this stuff is no one wants to talk about this when Vivekananda comes over. He's so popular, as I understand it, in Chicago, because he kind of presents Hinduism, as you mentioned yourself, as a almost like muscular Christianity. It's a kind of muscular Hinduism. I think to use your own terms on you. I think. Will you speak a little bit about that?
Vivekananda was really important in many ways, and one of the most, in terms of the ultimate impact, was to really both popularize and sort of sanitize, you might say, what many would regard as the misperceptions of yoga as a form of somehow mysterious and exotic forms of magical practice. But what Vivekananda did was to promote the idea that yoga is something that is appropriate and valuable for everybody to practice, rather than something which is arcane and exclusive. And that he did that in terms of really promoting the idea of Raj Yoga as a form of self-development that was primarily spiritual in the ecumenical sense and in the cosmopolitan sort of Catholic sense of spiritual, and really promoting the idea that it could be relevant to the modern age. Now, what's interesting about Vivekananda, however, is that even though he is well known for having advocated what I've called muscular Hinduism, others have called it muscular Hinduism as well, as the counterpoint to muscular Christianity, he was very skeptical about postural yoga. He thought that it was, something that didn't quite, that he didn't say very much about it, I don't think.
He hated it.
Right. I guess
he really hated it. I think, he tried. Didn't he try at one point? He did go, didn't he, to try and learn it? Maybe wasn't it off the Guru of Yogendra, and he kind of waited a couple of days and he didn't get a good reception or something, and he just kind of gave up and said, well, we haven't got time, and to muck around with yoga, physical posture when we're doing serious stuff.
Yeah,
but he needed it. He needed it, didn't he? He died very young. Could have done with a bit of yoga, maybe.
Well, perhaps, yeah. And I think, I don't want to track into Gandhi too much, but Gandhi as well was very ambivalent about the physical postural practice of yoga. Kuvalyananda kept instructing Gandhi to do pranayam, to do asana. And Gandhi would write back and say, well, I've tried it, but it really doesn't work very well. I'm not saying I won't continue to try it, but, I've got my own thing. Just leave me alone. I know what I know, and I'm going to do what I do, basically. Not quite that bad. But there's this curious, I wouldn't call it a contradiction, but a curious disjuncture between the modernization and popularization of yoga as a form of self-development is manifest by Vivekananda and Gandhi. And the physical practice, the trajectory of the history of physical practice, which is in dialogue with that, but is inspired by sort of a different set of priorities and interests. And it's, the characters involved are not only Kuvalyanand and Yogendra, and later on and Krishnamacharya, and then B.K.S. Iyengar. But interesting figures like Swami Shivanand, who established the Divine Life Society in Rishikesh, and his synthesis, I would call it. And there's really been good work done on this by Sarah Strauss and others, but more work really can be done on what Swami Shivananda was doing, just to overstate it, but to state it in a provocative way, is to take Neo-Vedanta as it had been developed by Vivekananda and to meld it with postural practice. Now that's overstating it completely, but Shivananda is an interesting figure because he brings back together what had been separated out in the late 19th century. And Kuvalyanand and Yogendra were very adamant about the spiritual possibilities, or not the spiritual, the soteriological, the transcendent possibilities of yoga in practice. But they were conflicted about how to reconcile that with physical practice. Shivananda is interesting because he focuses like a laser on exactly that problem and brings together postural practice and the possibility of a popularized soteriology of transcendence in the divine life. So the divine life that he talks about is the embodiment of transformation in the postural practice that is reconciled with all of the possibilities of enlightenment. Now, you can be skeptical of that, of course, and many people are. But for those who were trying to find that synthesis, Shivananda provided a really powerful mechanism by which to do in that form what Bikhanlal Atreya and Shanti Prakash Atreya were doing in their gymnasiums not too far away.